Hello everyone, and welcome to the new episode of the Darktable. Once more, I have decided to postpone my small series about color harmonies because we have one quite important topic that I would like to address today, and that is tone equalizer. Many users have complained about complexity of that module and have difficulties to understand how to set it up and to use it. So let's talk about that today. Tone equalizer is one of the tone mappers which can be used in Darktable, similar to tone curves or, for example, a shadows and highlights module, with a goal to be able to influence different brightness ranges of the photo individually. So practically to apply that old, from the analog photography known technique of touching and burning. And it's based on sound system from Ansel Adams, a quite famous American photographer known for his nice black and white landscape photos. And the idea behind that is to separate your dynamic range of the scene into 9 or 10 different brightness zones. So let's say we have the histogram here, something like that. And now you can separate those that scene or that photo into 9 different zones. Let's do that real quick. Doesn't need to be too precise. And then you have zone 1, which will be pure black, zone 9, which will be white. And the idea is that your main subject stays in the area around mid-gray, which will be zone 5. So your main subject or main motive should stay in that area around mid-gray. So let's say from zone 3 to the zone 7, because in that area you will be able to preserve the most important details of your motive. And how to do that? Let's demonstrate that on this photo. Let's say I would like to, the main motive in this scene or in this photo should be for me that nice texture of the wall. So I can now use exposure meter to measure the light intensity there. Let's try that. And now, as you can see, my exposure meter has shows me what kind of exposure value I need to use, so that this area will be in that mid-gray part, so let's say in that zone 5. But since if I use that value or that measurement, I will have quite dark photo. But since I know that these are the highlights, I could use that sound system and say, okay, I don't need to use that value, what I get from my measurement, but I can go about 2 exposure value higher. So let's say instead to use that middle gray zone 5, I can use zone 7. So I can go 2 exposure values higher, because I know that in zone 7 I will be able to preserve the details in the highlights, and I'm not underexposing my photos. In another example, let's say I would like to have these flowers here as my main motive. And now if I measure that area with my exposure measurement, you will see the photo is overexposed, but that area is now in a mid-gray in zone 5. So if I use that value, of course I will overexpose my photo, but since I know that this is the shadow area, I can go a little bit down with exposure, let's say to the zone 3, as I said before. So I don't want to use that value, but go to exposure value deeper, excuse me. And now I have nice details in that area. They are staying in the shadows, but I didn't lose the details, and I didn't overexpose the photo. That's the main essence of the zone system. Now you can apply that also in the, if you developing your photo in the darkroom and so on. That's quite complicated topic, and if you are interested to understand how that works or what is the idea behind it, you can search that in the internet, and you can find quite a lot of information. Here in Wikipedia we have that zone system explanation. It's quite large article, so if you want to understand that, you can inform yourself there. But the question is, how is that applied in Tone Equalizer? So let's start from scratch here. First, I would like to brighten a little bit our scene here, because we have a little bit more room in the highlights. So let's go a bit higher here. And now we have nice brightness of the photo, but let's say I would like to darken a little bit the highlights. In analog times, that was quite tedious process. So let's say you are in the dark room and you have the lamp here and film here, and you would like to expose the photo paper here. And now to be able to darken only this area, you will need one more black sheet paper over, and that black sheet you will need to cut out this area with the highlights. So let's say somewhere here. And now we'll need to expose first only that, and maybe in that time you will need to move that sheet of the black paper to avoid the sharp edges, and then you need to stop, remove that sheet, and then expose again the whole paper, and for a certain amount of time, and after that you will have a little bit darker highlights. As you can see, that is quite tedious and time-consuming process, and in Darktable or digital world, it's quite a lot easier. So when we go to Tone Equalizer, now we'll see those different zones. First is -8 EVs, and the last is the highlights. It's +0. And now if you go, let's enable it first, and if you go to the sun area that you want to influence, let's say we want to darken a little bit the sky here, and you can see the measurement. It says in this case -1.3 EVs. That means these sliders between these two sliders will be interesting for that area, -1 EV or -2 EVs, and we can move them. If we want to darken, we move to the left. If we want to brighten, we move to the right. But we can also go directly in the canvas and go to that area that we want to influence here, and now we can move mouse wheel up and down, and we will darken that particular area without influencing others. But as you can see, it's not one of those sliders moved, but moved a bit more of them, some kind of the core. We will talk about it later. But what we also can do, for example, we can go now to the darkest area. That is, let's say here, it says -6.3 EVs. So that means these sliders will be used. So let's go there and brighten that with mouse wheel. And as you can see, we have now some kind of brightening and darkening. So we have practically with few moves of our mouse wheel brighten and darken different areas of our photo. Quite easy. So that's quite intuitive, but we have some difficulties here. if I go, for example, in this area here, it says plus 0.5, and we don't have plus 0.5. The last zone is for us plus 0. So what's going on there? To be able to explain what's happening, let's go to the Advanced tab. And in the Advanced tab, we have the same version of those zones like in the Simple tab, but as some kind of the curve. So you see we have -8 to +0, and also we have here -8 and +0, but those zones are interconnected together with the help of one smooth curve. That is because if we want to influence some area here, we are also influencing the neighbors so that we avoid that harsh transition between those areas and some artifacts on the edges. And what you also can see, we have here some kind of histogram, and that histogram represents the histogram of the internal mask that tone equalizer uses to separate those different zones of our photo, of our dynamic range of our photo. Now I will turn that mask on to see how it looks like. And first things you can recognize, it's we have some blurring here. Why will we have blurring? I will talk later. But we will concentrate now only on the brightness. And as you may see, if I move now my mouse cursor to the different areas, we have different exposure values, and you see it also in the indication here. So for example, if I'm going there, that will be -6.3, and that is somewhere here. Or if I go maybe here, that is -1.3, that is here, and so on. So it's quite logical. We don't need to talk about much there. But as you may see in this area, we have some orange warning, and we cannot reach this one. So we have orange warning here that we are not able to reach this area. So what is going on here? Now I will show you that with Inkscape. I have here made some graphics, and this blue area represents that internal mask of tone equalizer with those points. And as you may see, we have this situation now. We can cover only the bottom part of the dynamic range of our photo, and those highlights here are not covered with our mask of the tone equalizer. Why is that? Why don't we have 12, let's say 12 points or 12 zones and cover everything? That's because the dynamic range of our camera is much higher than dynamic range of our display. Display cannot have more than 9 points or 9 stops of brightness difference. We have today, of course, HDR screens, but we are talking about screens that average user has, and that is about 9 exposure values from black to the white. So we need to adjust that internal mask of the tone equalizer to cover the whole, with those 9 points, to cover the whole dynamic range of our scene. That can be done in the masking tab. When we go to the masking tab, we have also symbolic representation of our mask range here. As you can see, we have that orange warning. That means the mask is not adjusted. We have some area that we cannot reach in the highlights. And to be able to adjust that, we can use first this slider, mask exposure compensation. Now we can click on the color picker, excuse me, and we have now centered our mask first, but we can still not reach some areas. Now we can reach, let's say, these highlights here, the highest highlights, but we are losing the shadows here, 8.0. Let's go to the advanced tab to show you. So we are not able, only with that slider, with mask exposure compensation, we are not able to cover the whole dynamic range. And that is what is happening is here. We have now with our mask exposure compensation, we have centered that mask. Let's say we are going to there, somewhere here. But we still need to adjust it, to stretch it, to be able to cover everything. So we will now use the next slider, mask contrast compensation. We can click on the on that thing here, but I think what we need to do is go to opposite. Let's say here and see 6.8, maybe 2, maybe less. 7.1, 7.5, to be able to be sure that we cover everything. Let's go back to advanced tab, and now you can see we have practically done this. We have stretched our mask, excuse me, so that that mask covers everything, something like that. So much important is to use those two sliders to adjust the mask so that you can cover everything if you want to influence everything. And now we have adjusted our mask. Let's turn it off and see how it looks like. Because we have made some changes without adjustment of mask, let's do that again. Now mask is adjusted, and we can now try to brighten and darken the area to our liking. So let's say I will darken a little bit sky, maybe this area of highlights, and brighten a bit more shadows and midtones. Just to, you can also move those points individually, so let me do that. I think we can better adjust that. And now it looks much better, before and after. And now the question is, why do we have that strange blurring of the mask? That is because beside that flexibility to adjust the mask, internal mask of the tone equalizer to the dynamic range of our photo, as demonstrated here, which by the way is not only for that adjustment to the screen, it has another advantages. We will talk a little bit later. Beside that, we have also a few algorithms, few nice algorithms for details preservation in different areas. What that mean, I can demonstrate you real quick. Now for default setting, we have preservation of details, one algorithm that's called exposure independent guided filter, AIGF, which is default option. And if I disable that, you can see how the mask now looks like. Looks like practically black and white version of our original photo. And tone equalizer acts now as a simple tone curve. So let's enable it again and disable the mask so that you can see the difference. That is now with exposure independent guided filter as default option. And if I disable it, our scene looks like that now. So you may recognize, oh, excuse me, you may see here, for example, we are losing some details. And let's enable exposure independent guided filter, and you can see we have our local contrast back. That is a quite big difference between tone equalizer and other tone mappers like tone curve. And as you can see, you can also use the tone equalizer as simple tone curve if you wish, by disabling that preservation of details. Now we have quite different algorithms here, and I will say that default algorithm, exposure independent guided filter and guided filter are most useful. So we will play a little bit with those two. Okay, let's change now exposure independent guided filter to guided filter and see what happens. And as you may have noticed, we have even more local contrast. We have preserved even more local contrast, but we have some hollowing here on those edges here. You maybe can recognize that there. So the guided filter is quite useful for brightening the shadows, but you may have those difficulties with hollowing on the edges. But we're not stuck there. We also have 3 different sliders for improvement of that different algorithms to get rid of different issues that we are creating. So first one is edges refinement feathering. Let's see what that does. Let's turn the mask first. And as you may see, the difference, by the way, between guided filter and exposure independent guided filter is that the guided filter is bleeding on the edges, from the highlights into the shadows, and that is causing that hollowing. But we can improve that a little bit with edges refinement feathering. That will be one of sliders. Let's move that to the right and see what happens. And now, as you may see, now we are forcing guided filter to take account those edges and don't bleed too much in the other areas. So let's see the result. Let's go back. That was the starting position about there. And now if I move it to the right, you see that we now are improving the guided filter with that option. Before and after. But if we are going, we can also go quite high if you want. We're not 50 is not the last option. We can also go further. We can type, let's say 200, just for the sake of demonstration. And now we have quite similar filter as exposure independent guided filter. So you don't want to go too high if you want to use guided filter because you can also use the first option. Let's stay there. This looks okay now, more or less. But we have other options too. So we have filter diffusion. Let's see what that does. That is practically a lot of number of passes of that guided filter repeated. And you see the image gets even blurrier, but the highlights are staying untouched, as you may see. So it's quite good if you want to darken, if you want to improve the dark areas, to brighten dark areas. You can use filter diffusion to maintain even more of the local contrasts. You see that? The difference. Maybe you can leave it here. And we have the third option, smoothing diameter, which is quite similar to the filter diffusion, but smoothing diameter smooths the shadows much more, as adds the diffusion of quite a lot of diffusion, and that can also be helpful. Let's see, to avoid the artifacts. I don't know, let's start from scratch now and choose, let's disable completely tone equalizer and adjust it again completely. So first thing what we need to do is to adjust mask exposure compensation to center everything in the middle. Then maybe I will use, in this case I will use a bit more mask contrast compensation so that I have everything covered. That's not necessary always, but let's use it for the sake of the demonstrations here. And now I can decide what I want to do. I don't want to touch the highlights, for example, not too much. I will just like to improve the shadows. I can go of course with mouse wheel, but I prefer to do that manually here. Let's say something like that. Don't need to go too far. I don't want to touch the highlights. Now I can use guided filter, for example, to improve those local contrast even better. And as you can see, by using a guided filter, the mask exposure has changed also. I can improve that also a little bit, just to be able to move those shadow parts a bit more, something like that. And to avoid those issues on the edges, I can use edge refinement, feathering, let's say, until there. And I think we have a nice improvement for brightness of our photo without inducing any kind of issues. And we can now further process our photo. Now we can improve overall contrast of our photo with using color balance RGB. So I will go a bit higher with perceptual brilliance grading. Maybe go back a little bit of shadows and add some saturation. And as you can see, I have already overexposed the photos with highlight slider. And now I can also use tone equalizer for that, to improve that overexposure. So let's use one more instance. Go back to the tone equalizer, use one more instance. Adjust again the mask, but this time I'm not interested in the shadows. I just want to influence those highlights, and I can adjust the internal mask of the tone equalizer to do that. For example, I can go to the left, so to be able to use a few of those zones only for the highlights, and also improve the mask contrast, so spread that mask, so to say. And now I cannot reach some areas in the darkness, but I'm not interested to improve those. I'm interested that I have a few of those points here only for the highlights, as I have done here. So we have practically this situation. For example, I want to influence only this part of the histogram. Now I can move what I have done. I have moved that there, and also tighten a little bit the contrast so that I have 3 or 4 sliders only for the highlights. That is what I have done here. So practically what I have done, I have moved the whole mask here in that area, the highlight area. Now I don't have any possibilities to reach the shadows, what is not, because I'm not interested in that. I don't care. I'm interested just to adjust this part. So I have moved the whole mask to the left and also add a little contrast. So that means I have tightened that mask so that I can use few of those sliders only for the shadow, for the highlights. Let's improve the highlights now. Now I have, if you see, I have this range about only for the highlights. So let's go down with that. I don't want to use another guided filter or something else. We'll just use that default option, exposure independent guided filter. In most cases you don't need to change that. And now we can improve our highlights again. So that's quite nice. You see, now we have everything inside our gamut, our dynamic range. You can just check the clipping indicator. We have used tone equalizer twice, once for the whole scene and one for just for the highlights. And that is a quite nice option that tone equalizer offers you. to be able to flexible use that mask for that part of dynamic range that you want to influence. So you can influence the whole range if you wish by adjusting that mask, or some particular range, shadows for example, or highlights to your liking. I could also have used, if I wanted, first one only for shadows, the second one for highlights and so on. So that is nice option that you can use with tone equalizer. Beside that option of playing with different algorithms to get a quite nice preservation of the details. You will never be able to do that with curves or with other modules. Okay, let's see before and after. Let's go, for example, to the filmic RGB, turn the snapshot on and go to the last step, and you may see we have quite nice improvement of the brightness of the photo, overall brightness of the photo, without inducing any kind of issues, haloing or fringing or whatever. That is quite powerful tool for tone mapping. It's, I will say, Swiss knife for this kind of work. Okay, let's see few another examples. So let's use this photo now, and this photo, as you may see has a quite big difference between highlights and shadows. So first thing what we need to do is to adjust the exposure a little bit. We have enough room for that with exposure module, and now we can try to brighten a little bit the shadows. So we can use tone equalizer, turn it on, adjust our mask exposure compensation so that we center the mask a little bit, and let me disable snapshot. As you may see, and now I can reach every shade area of the shadows, but some area in the highlights I cannot reach. I don't want to adjust also the contrast because I just want to influence the shadows, so let's do that first. Let's move a little bit of sliders and brighten the shadows to some extent. Let's say something like that. Now I can also try to improve that mask. I can try, for example, guided filter and see that I have some improvements. I don't think that we have much improvements in the shadows, a little bit on the highlights or midtones. So I will stay by exposure independent guided filter, and maybe improved it a little bit with filter diffusion. So let's go up. It will be quite similar like a guided filter, but you see we have diffusion in the areas here, which can be quite useful to preserve details there. So instead to use guided filter, I can use now exposure independent guided filter with that filter diffusion. Maybe not too far, let's stay there. And maybe improve just a tiny bit edges refinement, so that exposure independent guided filter following a bit more the edges, and we don't have too much issues on the edges. Something like that. Just need a little bit of improvement. And practically we are done with tone equalizer. We now can use color bar at RGB, maybe go even a bit higher here, and add some saturation. And to be able to improve the highlights again, we can also use one more instance of tone equalizer. Just adjust the mask to be able to touch the highlights and go a tiny bit down. Let's say something like that. Improve a bit refinement. And now we are back in the dynamic range. And as the last step, I could also use diffuse and sharpen just for improving the local contrast even more. And you can see now Although there's quite a big difference between shadows and highlights. Now we see every details in the shadows and also in the highlights. So let's see before and after. Let's start with a filmic, take a snapshot and go to the last step. And you see, it's quite nice. Improvement without any issues, hallowing or fringing or whatever. And we can also try to see. We only have some overexposure here, but I have also that overexposure in the raw file itself, so I don't care. It's not the important part. Okay, let's see another example. Here we also need to improve exposure first. Let's go it up, maybe that much or that much. And I would like to improve the shadows, so let's use tone equalizer again. Adjust the mask and see. And I think I can touch some areas. So let's remove the mask a little bit to the left, to the right, excuse me, so that we are able to reach every shadow part. I don't want to touch mask contrast compensation, it's not necessary. And that's enough. And now let's improve the shadows a tiny bit. And as you may see, in all those examples, I don't use just one particular area. I always try to give some smooth curve, because that way your brightening looks much more natural. So don't try to use just one of those sliders or two. Try to add some nice curve, that range. And as you see, our photo looks a little bit flat. So I can try now to use another algorithm, guided filter, and in this case guided filter works quite nicely. As you can see, we have tons of more local contrast. I will just improve the edges refinement so that we avoid some fringing or some hallowing. I don't know, filter diffusion. No, there's not much improvement. Well, let's leave it there. Excuse me. Smoothing diameter, I don't think we also need. I think it's okay as it is. And now you go to the color balance RGB, add some contrasts, saturation, and as you can see, I could now improve with tone equalizer that area which is a little bit overexposed, but I can also use filmic and add some compression, and we are done with that. We don't need have only a little bit overexposure here, but it is not interesting. Now, another option, what can be interesting for if you want to retain some details in the highlights, you can use tone equalizer with two different instances. For example, I would like to have a little bit more texture on that area here, and now I can use one instance of tone equalizer with enabled option of details preservation and darken that area, highlights, let's say go quite down. And now I can use next instance of tone equalizer, but this time a simple tone curve, for example, without preservation of details. And now if I go with highlights back higher, I'm increasing even more that details on the wall. So let's compare that. It was the last instance. Only with tone equalizer, it will use snapshot and see what happens after we use those two equalizers extra for the highlights. One with preservation of details, which we have used for darkening that area, and then the second one without preservation of details for adding the brightness back. And you see, this area we have much more details. that is quite nice trick if you want to enhance the details in the highlights. See that? Okay, let's try the last example. This will be our last example, and as you may see, this photo has also quite large dynamic range, and let's improve that first with some corrections here. Go with exposure a little bit higher. And now normally in last examples I always improve the shadows, but we can go also opposite way. We can now, for example, go with exposure quite high. I don't know, let's say 5 EVs or a bit less. Let's stay here and now use tone equalizer to darken the rest. So first we need, of course, to adjust that mask because we don't cover everything. So mask exposure compensation, and as you may see, all in shadows and in highlights we are not reaching everything. I could now use mask contrast compensation, so it's just a tiny bit to fit that range into the mask. And now only what I need to do is to darken a little bit of highlights. Let's say something like that. And I can also try another filter, guided filter, and I have also much more contrasts, as you can see. So, and I don't have that much fringing or haloing here. I will improve just a tiny bit of edges and I can leave it there. And the rest we can do with color balance RGB. Let's improve it even further. Just add some saturation. Maybe also clarity. Another thing which is clipping, I think it's just this tiny area. We can use filmic for that. Just compress a tiny bit the dynamic range. That's enough. We don't need to touch anything else. And as you may see, I have only used one tone equalizer and have now different approach. I first added a lot of exposure to be able to see every details in the shadows and use tone equalizer to darken the rest. So let's see before and after. Lens correction maybe. Snapshot and go to the last step, and here we are. Quite nice, you see. And if you want to improve the details here, I don't want to do that. If here you can use one more, for example, one more tone equalizer and just adjust this one. But it's not necessary, I think. For this scene, we're quite good as it is now. And in this whole episode, you have seen how powerful tone equalizer is. If you know how to use it, you can improve your dynamic range of your photo or of your motive quite a lot without any issues, and you also don't need to touch any other modules for that. For example, I've just touched the filmic twice for just a little bit adding compression, although we have dealt with a lot of scenes with a lot of dynamic range difference. So, okay, this is the last example, and now I can concentrate on my next series. Excuse me for that I postponed those few times, but that was quite important what I would like to address so that user can be able to follow the steps in the next episodes without asking themselves how and why I'm using for some modules. Okay, thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please be free to ask in the comment section or in a pixels.us discussion forum. Bye bye.